After 49 years of marriage, Paul Bowen thought he knew everything about his wife Karen. They had built a life together, a life filled with love, family, and memories. 2 children, 4 grandchildren, and nearly 5 decades of shared experiences. To the outside world, they were the epitome of a strong, enduring marriage. But behind closed doors, cracks had begun to form. Karen's restlessness, her search for excitement, and Paul's struggles with his own insecurities were slowly eroding the foundation of their relationship. Still, Paul believed they could weather any storm. He believed in their bond. Until one fateful day when everything changed. It was supposed to be a day of joy. Paul had just returned from a hunting trip, eager to surprise Karen with a thoughtful gift. But as he stepped into their home, he was met with a sight that would shatter his world forever. Karen wasn't alone. She was in bed with 2 younger men. In that moment, decades of trust, love, and loyalty unraveled in an instant. What followed was a tragic confrontation that left 2 men dead, a family torn apart, and a community in shock. This is the story of Paul Bowen, a man who went from a devoted husband and grandfather to a convicted killer. But what drives a man to commit such a heinous act? Was it betrayal, rage, or something deeper? And could this tragedy have been avoided? As we unravel this shocking case, we'll explore the emotional complexities of love, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of unchecked anger. But we also want to hear from you. What would you have done in Paul's shoes? Have you or someone you know ever faced betrayal in a relationship? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And if you're as intrigued as we are, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who love gripping true crime stories. Your engagement helps us reach more people and uncover more stories like this one. Now, let's dive deeper into the events that led to this tragic day and the aftermath that would change Paul Bowen's life forever. Paul and Karen Bowen's story began like so many others. A chance meeting, a whirlwind romance, and a promise to spend the rest of their lives together. For nearly 5 decades, they built a life that many would envy. They raised 2 children, welcomed 4 grandchildren, and created a home filled with memories. To their friends and family, they were the picture of stability, a couple who had weathered the storms of life and come out stronger. But beneath the surface, their marriage was far from perfect. As the years went by, the challenges of life began to take their toll. Karen, once a devoted wife and mother, started to feel restless. She spoke of wanting to find herself, a phrase that left Paul confused and uneasy. In her late 50s, Karen took a brief but significant step away from their marriage, leaving Paul to grapple with feelings of abandonment and self-doubt. Though she eventually returned, the cracks in their relationship had already begun to show. For Paul, the later years of their marriage brought their own set of struggles. He faced health issues, including erectile dysfunction, which left him feeling inadequate as a husband. Paul, a man who had always prided himself on being a provider and protector, now felt as though he was failing Karen in the most intimate way. Despite his efforts to address the issue, the emotional distance between them only grew. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to be searching for something more. She began suggesting ways to spice up their relationship, including the idea of an open marriage. For Paul, a man deeply rooted in traditional values, this was unthinkable. The very suggestion left him feeling humiliated and overwhelmed. He couldn't understand why the life they had built together wasn't enough for her. Karen, however, saw it differently. She craved excitement, new experiences, and a sense of freedom that she felt their marriage no longer provided. These differences created a growing emotional tension between them. Paul, ever the optimist, believed they could work through it. He clung to the hope that their shared history and love for their family would be enough to hold them together. But Karen's restlessness only deepened. She began spending more time away from home, often with friends or at social events, leaving Paul to wonder what she was searching for, and whether she had already found it. As the years passed, the emotional distance between Paul and Karen became a chasm. Paul's feelings of inadequacy and Karen's desire for excitement created a volatile mix of emotions. Yet, despite the growing tension, Paul never imagined that their marriage would end in betrayal, or that it would lead to a tragedy that would change their lives forever. This was the foundation of their relationship, a seemingly strong marriage built on decades of love and loyalty, but one that was slowly crumbling under the weight of unmet needs and unspoken resentments. And as we'll see, it was only a matter of time before these cracks turned into a devastating rupture. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Paul Bowen returned home from a weekend hunting trip. The trip had been a chance for him to clear his mind, to escape the growing tension in his marriage, and to reflect on how he could rekindle the love he once shared with Karen. In his truck, he carried a small gift, a delicate necklace he had picked out for her at a roadside shop. It wasn't extravagant, but it was thoughtful, a token of his love and a gesture of hope for their future. As he pulled into the driveway of their modest suburban home, Paul had no idea that his life was about to change forever. The house was unusually quiet. Karen's car was in the driveway, but there were no sounds of the television or the faint hum of her favorite music playing in the background. Paul stepped inside, calling out her name, his voice echoing through the empty hallway. Something felt off. The air was heavy, and a strange unease began to creep over him. He noticed a pair of unfamiliar shoes near the door, men's shoes. His heart began to race as he moved further into the house, his hunting gear still slung over his shoulder. As Paul climbed the stairs, he could hear faint voices coming from the bedroom. At first he thought he must be mistaken. But as he reached the top of the stairs, the muffled sounds became clearer, laughter, whispers, and the unmistakable tone of intimacy. His hands trembled as he pushed open the bedroom door, and what he saw on the other side would haunt him for the rest of his life. Karen was in bed with two younger men, their laughter abruptly silenced as the door swung open. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Paul's mind raced, a whirlwind of emotions flooding his senses: shock, betrayal, humiliation, and an overwhelming sense of rage. The woman he had loved for nearly 50 years, the mother of his children, the grandmother of his grandchildren, had shattered the very foundation of their life together. And in that moment, something inside Paul snapped. What happened next was a blur of chaos and violence. Paul, still carrying his hunting rifle, raised the weapon in a fit of uncontrollable rage. The two men scrambled to get out of bed, their panic only fueling Paul's fury. He fired the first shot, striking one of the men in the chest. The second man lunged toward him, but Paul pulled the trigger again, the sound of the gunshot echoing through the house. Both men collapsed, their lives ending in an instant. Karen screamed, her voice piercing through the silence that followed. But Paul didn't hear her. He was frozen, staring at the scene before him, the weight of what he had done slowly sinking in. In the aftermath of the violence, Paul dropped the rifle and sank to his knees. The room was filled with a deafening silence, broken only by Karen's sobs. The reality of his actions began to set in, but it was too late to turn back. Two men were dead, and the life Paul had known was gone forever. The betrayal he had discovered in that bedroom had unleashed a storm of emotions he could no longer control, and the consequences would be devastating. But this was only the beginning of the nightmare for Paul and his family. The moments after the gunshots rang out were eerily silent. Paul Bowen, still clutching the rifle, stood frozen in the bedroom, his mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. The two men lay lifeless on the floor, their blood staining the carpet. Karen, trembling and in shock, screamed at Paul, her voice breaking through the suffocating quiet. But Paul didn't respond. He dropped the rifle to the floor, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The weight of his actions began to sink in, and with it came a crushing sense of despair. Karen, still in a state of disbelief, scrambled to grab her phone. She dialed 911, her voice frantic as she begged for help. "My husband, he's killed them," she cried, her words barely coherent through her sobs. Paul didn't try to stop her. He didn't run. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, waiting for the inevitable. When law enforcement arrived, they found Paul exactly where Karen had left him, silent, motionless, and consumed by the gravity of what he had done. The scene inside the Bowen home was nothing short of horrifying. Investigators meticulously documented the evidence: the rifle lying on the floor, the blood-soaked carpet, and the two victims who had been shot at close range. Paul was taken into custody without resistance, his demeanor calm but hollow. During his initial interrogation, he confessed to the killings, his voice devoid of emotion. "I lost control," he told detectives. "I couldn't take it anymore." His confession was straightforward, leaving no doubt about his guilt. As the investigation unfolded, more shocking details began to emerge. Karen, under questioning, admitted that her infidelity had not been a one-time mistake. Over the years, she had engaged in multiple affairs, a revelation that sent shockwaves through their family and community. For Paul, this was a second betrayal, one that deepened the emotional wounds he had already suffered. Their children, blindsided by the truth, struggled to reconcile the image of their parents' seemingly perfect marriage with the reality of what had been happening behind closed doors. The media quickly picked up the story, and it wasn't long before the Bowen case became a national headline. News outlets painted Paul as both a victim and a villain, a man driven to violence by the ultimate betrayal. Some sympathized with him, arguing that his actions were the result of years of emotional torment. Others condemned him, labeling him a cold-blooded killer who had taken 2 lives in a fit of rage. The public was divided, and the case sparked heated debates about infidelity, mental health, and the limits of human endurance. In the small community where the Bowens had lived for decades, the case was particularly polarizing. Neighbors who had once admired Paul and Karen as a loving, devoted couple now whispered about the secrets that had been hidden behind their front door. The revelations about Karen's affairs and Paul's violent outburst shattered the idyllic image they had worked so hard to maintain. For their children and grandchildren, the fallout was devastating. The family was left to grapple with the loss of their once stable foundation, now irreparably broken. As the investigation came to a close, the evidence against Paul was overwhelming. His confession, combined with the physical evidence at the scene, left little room for doubt. But the question remained, what had truly driven him to commit such a heinous act? Was it a moment of blind rage, or had years of emotional pain finally pushed him past the breaking point? These were the questions that would haunt not only Paul but everyone who knew him. The Bowen case was far from over. The trial would bring new revelations, emotional testimony, and a verdict that would leave the community divided. But for Paul, the nightmare had already begun and there was no turning back. The trial of Paul Bowen began under a cloud of public scrutiny and emotional tension. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and members of the community, all eager to witness the proceedings of a case that had captivated the nation. On one side, Paul sat quietly, his face etched with regret and exhaustion. On the other, the prosecution prepared to paint him as a man who had allowed his rage to spiral into deadly violence. The stakes were high, and the outcome would determine whether Paul would spend the rest of his life behind bars, or if the court would show leniency to a man many saw as a victim of betrayal. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case. They argued that Paul's actions were premeditated, pointing to the fact that he had used his hunting rifle, a weapon he was intimately familiar with, to kill the 2 men. They described the crime as a brutal and calculated act of revenge, fueled by Paul's inability to control his emotions. The prosecutor emphasized that no amount of betrayal could justify taking 2 lives, and they urged the jury to hold Paul accountable for his actions. Paul's defense team, however, painted a very different picture. They described him as a devoted husband and grandfather who had been pushed to the brink by years of emotional torment. They argued that Paul's actions were not premeditated but rather the result of a momentary lapse in judgment, a crime of passion committed in the heat of the moment. The defense highlighted Paul's clean record, his contributions to the community, and the devastating impact Karen's infidelity had on his mental state. They urged the jury to consider the emotional toll of betrayal and to view Paul not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a man who had reached his breaking point. The most emotional moments of the trial came during the testimony from Paul and Karen's family. Their children, visibly shaken, spoke about the pain of losing not only their father to the justice system but also the image of the loving family they had once believed in. One of their grandchildren, through tears, described how the tragedy had torn their family apart, leaving scars that would never fully heal. Karen herself took the stand, her voice trembling as she admitted to her infidelity and expressed deep regret for the role she had played in the events that unfolded. Her testimony was a stark reminder of the emotional complexities at the heart of the case. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Paul Bowen was found guilty of manslaughter, a decision that reflected the jury's belief that while his actions were inexcusable, they were not premeditated. The judge sentenced Paul to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. Some felt it was too lenient, arguing that Paul had taken 2 lives and deserved a harsher punishment. Others believed it was fair, given the emotional circumstances that had led to the crime. The case sparked widespread debate, both in the media and among the public. Some saw Paul as a tragic figure, a man who had been driven to violence by the ultimate betrayal. Others criticized the narrative, arguing that it perpetuated toxic masculinity by excusing violent behavior as a response to emotional pain. The discussions highlighted broader societal issues, including the impact of infidelity, the pressures of traditional gender roles, and the fine line between justice and compassion. For Paul, the trial marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A life behind bars, where he would have to confront the consequences of his actions and the pain he had caused. For his family, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but it also left them grappling with the emotional fallout of a tragedy that had forever changed their lives. The aftermath of Paul Bowen's actions left a ripple effect that devastated his family and community. For his children, the trial and conviction were only the beginning of their pain. They had grown up idolizing their parents' seemingly unshakable bond, a marriage that had spanned nearly 5 decades. But the revelations of Karen's infidelity and Paul's violent outburst shattered that image, leaving them to reconcile the parents they thought they knew with the harsh reality of what had unfolded. Their grandchildren, too young to fully understand the complexities of betrayal and rage, were left with a fractured family and unanswered questions about the grandparents they had once adored. Karen, now living alone, faced the weight of her own guilt. Her choices had set off a chain of events that led to unimaginable tragedy. She became a pariah in her community, with many blaming her for the destruction of her family. Yet, Karen herself admitted that she never anticipated the depth of Paul's pain or the consequences of her actions. In interviews, she expressed regret, not only for her infidelity but for the years of emotional distance that had driven a wedge between them. Still, the damage was done, and the life they had built together was irreparably broken. For Paul, prison became a place of reflection and reckoning. Stripped of his freedom and the life he had once known, he was left to confront the enormity of his actions. In letters to his family, Paul expressed deep remorse, not only for the lives he had taken but for the pain he had caused his children and grandchildren. He spoke of sleepless nights haunted by the events of that fateful day and the moments leading up to it. Yet, he also found solace in routine and in the support of other inmates who shared their own stories of regret and redemption. Paul's time in prison became a journey of self-examination, but it was one that came too late to undo the damage. The Bowen case became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the fragility of human relationships and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions. It raised difficult questions about love, betrayal, and the limits of forgiveness. How does a marriage survive decades of challenges, only to crumble under the weight of secrets and unmet needs? And what drives a person to commit an act of violence that changes the course of so many lives? As we reflect on this tragic story, we leave you with this question. Was Paul Bowen a victim of circumstance, pushed to the edge by betrayal and emotional pain? Or did he let his emotions get the better of him, allowing rage to dictate his actions? Could this tragedy have been avoided? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue the conversation about the complexities of love, loyalty, and the human condition. The story of Paul and Karen Bowen is one of love, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions. It's a case that forces us to confront the fragility of human relationships and the emotional toll of betrayal. For nearly 5 decades, Paul and Karen built a life together, weathering challenges that many couples face. But beneath the surface, unresolved pain and unmet needs created a rift that neither of them could repair. When betrayal entered the picture, it ignited a chain of events that would end in tragedy, leaving 2 men dead, a family shattered, and a community divided. This case is a stark reminder of how quickly emotions can spiral out of control when trust is broken. It raises difficult questions about accountability, forgiveness, and the limits of human endurance. Was Paul Bowen a victim of circumstance, pushed to the edge by years of emotional pain? Or did he allow his rage to consume him, making a choice that could never be undone? These are questions that linger long after the courtroom verdict, questions that force us to reflect on the complexities of love and the consequences of our actions. This case reminds us that even the strongest relationships can be tested in unimaginable ways. But when betrayal and rage collide, the consequences can be devastating. What do you think? Was Paul's reaction justified, or did he go too far? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this story as gripping as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with fellow true crime enthusiasts. Your engagement helps us uncover and share more stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.